For this lesson on button styles, I want to cover 3 important factors when determining what type of button, what type of style, all the ingredients that go into making buttons. First, you have size. What size should the button be? Next, you have state. Which states of the button do I need to prepare for? There's default, inactive, rollover, roll out, long press, all these different types of states that typically refer to a moment in time. You'll need to design for those moments. Not every single state, but a lot of them you will. And it's helpful to kind of go over all the possibilities. And then lastly, I want to take a look at what is the function of the button. Is it a primary action? Is it a secondary action? Is it a tertiary action? Now, we've covered a lot of different little nuances between corner radius and gradient and interactive and things like that, but I want to just really dive into the ins and outs of these buttons. So let's take a look. Okay, first of all, we have size. Now, I've broken up these 5 different sizes. So we've got extra large, large, medium, small, and extra small. Now, I do have a list of all of this information inside of Notion. You can scroll down to see the size, the state, and the function, even a link to this Figma file. So first of all, size. Most of the time, and again, this is largely dependent on your context, most of the time you're gonna be hanging out in the large to medium, possibly in the small range, depending on your action. This would normally only be used on a big marketing site with a big call to action. Maybe in like you could imagine if there was a huge image up here and some text down here, and there was like a really big call to action, and maybe it was for quite a large screen. Maybe this is the biggest media query for your 19,000 pixel wide screen. There are some cases where your style may warrant a really extra large button. And in those cases, it might require extra large text, like 24 pixel. And all of these are created in Figma using the auto layout feature. So they will automatically get larger as you type. So we've got our extra large button. So right here, you can see I've got about 24 pixels of vertical padding, and then I've doubled that for the horizontal. And that's generally a good rule, is to, whatever your vertical padding is, if you double that on the sides, that will be like a good rule of thumb. And as with all of these rules, they're all made to be broken. You can do whatever you want, and as long as you have a basic understanding of what creates a good button, and then you go from there, you can do whatever you want. But if you're feeling a little unsure, these are great starting points. Okay, now we have our large button. This is gonna be roughly 16 pixels of text. If you were gonna go, say you were gonna go all caps, that's gonna look a little bit larger than your 16. So it will be totally fine to go with like a 14-point font in your all caps font style, and that would still be considered a large button. And it doesn't matter if it's large or medium or whatever you wanna call it, it's just a frame of reference. So this would still be quite a large button, even with the 14-point font with all caps. It looks similar in size. If not, it might even command a little bit more attention because it is all caps. But you can see again here, I've got a 16 pixel vertical padding and a 32 pixel horizontal padding. And this ends up being about a 48 pixel tall button. You'll notice that on iOS, some of their smallest button sizes, they recommend like a 44 point touch target. So in the 44, 48, 50, 52, right in there is a good kind of medium go-to button size. And I said medium, I meant large, but it is kind of a medium large button size. And looking down at our actual medium button, you can see I've got this one at 14. This could be a range from 12 to 14. This one I've got 12 pixels of vertical padding and 24. Again, I'm doubling those end measurements. It's not that you couldn't do a 12, 12, 12, but you can just see it. It usually looks a little bit uneven if you leave it like that. So you don't necessarily have to double it. You could just make it slightly larger. Even that even works, 12 and 16 on the sides. But just as a general rule of thumb, you're not gonna go wrong with doubling the horizontal padding compared to the vertical. On down here to the small button, you can see here I've got 12 pixels of text, and I've got 6 pixels of vertical, 12 pixels of horizontal margin. I've also made the background color a bit darker. So you can see this is 0066DD, whereas the ones up here are 008FF. And really, once you get smaller like this, once you go below 14 point bold, 14, 16 point bold, you really need to start trying to pass AA instead of only AA large with your accessibility. So that's why I've gone a little bit darker with my small buttons, and then my tiny extra small button with 10 pixels, 10 pixel font size, extra small. Now this is gonna be used pretty sparingly. This might be a tiny module. This might be a plus, add a tiny line item to a tiny module, or it could be, if it didn't have a background color, it could be link only, like privacy policy, terms and conditions, things like that. It could very well be a link and not necessarily an actual button. But these are some good basic button sizes just to get started with, especially the large, medium range. If you're unsure, these are great sizes to get started with. And you can see I'm actually using a little bit of a gradient on here. I've got a little bit of an inner shadow, a little bit of a drop shadow, just to try to reinforce the fact that these are buttons. You don't have to use these stylistic effects. You can use flat colors if you want, but you'll see as we get into the states, it's often a little bit easier to add some dimensionality to these buttons to really show what the state is. And again, I've designed tons and tons of things that don't have any gradients, no shadows, but I've used it for this illustration just because it's a little bit easier to show those moments of time like we're talking about here. So first of all, we've got our default button. And just to point out, I'm using the medium size here for all of these buttons. It would work exactly the same way with any of the other sizes. So we've got our default button here. This would be just your default button, the one that is showing by default. And on this one, we've got a rollover. So maybe on this one, you can see it's a little bit darker. So I've darkened the gradient just a little bit to indicate what would happen on rollover. Now, and you can design these in a static format, but a lot of times it's much easier to have a quick little prototype just to kind of, you almost need that moment of time to see a rollover and then see the roll out and just kind of get a feel for, is that dark enough? Does it need to go lighter? Should it shift a little bit more? Sometimes it's hard to really make those decisions until you get it into either code or a quick little prototype, just using some like artboard to artboard transitions. Now, roll out, most of the time your roll out function is going to be the exact reverse of your roll over function. But you could delay the rollout by 3 seconds, whereas the roll over might happen in a quarter of a second. And that way you roll over, it changes really fast, and then you roll out and then it fades out slowly. There is the possibility to have a slightly different rollout function. And again, remember, this is only going to work for using a mouse. There is no rollover and there is no rollout on a touch device like a phone or a tablet. So keep that in mind. Okay, so next we have press. This would be when you actually press down or you click down on the button. Nothing necessarily has to happen, but it is another function that will fire and provide that visual state of what the button does. In this example, I've simply reversed the gradient to make it look a little more concave, just showing this has now been pressed. Sometimes you might move the y-axis down, -1, -2. Sometimes you might reverse the gradient. Sometimes you might make it a little bit darker, just something to make it look like it has been pushed back into the environment. And if you're using flat colors, it might just be a slightly darker color to make it look like it was pressed back. And for long press, this would be a similar function, a similar visual state, but you'll most likely see this on mobile when you tap and hold. That would be considered a long press. And sometimes you might get a growing background style. Sometimes you might press and hold and it becomes a draggable little interactive piece. It just kind of depends on how you're using the button, how you're using the functionality, but just something to keep in mind that is another possible state depending on the buttons that you're designing. Release would be what happens when you click and then you let go. So when you let go, it might change completely. The button might flip over and a progress bar starts. It's kind of what happens after the button has been let go, whether it's the finger or the mouse. It's slightly different than rollout, slightly different than press, because pressing is the action going down and then releasing is coming up. So it's very subtle, but it's important to know that there are all these little tiny micro interactions associated with buttons. All right, next we've got our inactive buttons. These can be kind of tricky to handle, especially on mobile. You can see here that I've brought in the cursor that is kind of like the not allowed cursor. And this would just mean, hey, you cannot click on this button right now. This would be kind of an alternate style, but it's important to know that a lot of times your inactive buttons, they might actually fail contrast accessibility, because if I brought this up to 100%, and this is actually as light as you could possibly go with this blue and this white, this barely passes AA large. So going down to 50% opacity is definitely going to make this button fail accessibility. However, we don't want it to be contrasty enough to where it actually looks like a full clickable button. So in the inactive button case, you're gonna have to do something and bring the opacity down, make it gray, or sometimes completely just remove the button. But sometimes you want to keep the context. You want the user to know something can happen eventually. Maybe sometimes the save button on a form is grayed out until all of the fields are accessible. But you kind of have to use this with discretion depending on the project that you're designing for and the screen. But the big takeaway for the inactive buttons is if you use too much contrast, it's going to look like a clickable button. And especially on mobile, you don't have the cursor like this to kind of bail you out of that situation. So just make sure that you use enough reduced saturation to where it's unmistakably not active. All right, next up would be this destructive button. This would be anything that's going to permanently delete something. Like I need to delete my account. I need to deactivate Facebook. I need to destroy this record in my account of whatever software. Maybe I'm deleting a GitHub repo. Something needs to happen and it's going to cause destruction. It will remove something from a database and it cannot be retrieved. So a lot of times you want that to be styled slightly differently. And red is a great color because red almost universally means stop or, wait a second. It could be orange, one of those danger colors. And it doesn't absolutely have to be this red color. It could have it could be a black text links, but maybe there's a red triangle with an exclamation point. Something to kind of let you know that this is a destructive action. It really can't be undone. And a lot of times this button would link to a modal or an alert and say, are you sure you would like to delete this? And there's like a fail safe. Someone would have to say, yes, I do want to delete this, things like that. But it's always helpful if you're going to have destructive actions in your app, in your project, that you treat them slightly differently than your normal save buttons because it has a different implication for the way it's being used. All right, next up, we've got our selected button. This would be almost more like a view switcher or a tab bar in iOS, like a tabbed view switcher. This would also be for like radio buttons or checkboxes. Basically, you have a selected state and you have a deselected state. And I just put in a couple of different examples here of different deselected states. Now, you have to be tricky that your deselected states don't look inactive because you want them to be selectable. Also, in this particular example, this might not work as well because all of my regular default primary actions are blue. And right here I'm using blue again, which looks exactly like the major call to action, the primary call to action. So I might be better off using darker colors for something like that instead of my primary call to action. Like even in iOS now, it has the kind of light gray background with the white pill that's been selected, and it almost looks like it's in this groove, this track. And typically you would want this to be, if it's a really big view switcher type of area, you would need it to be slightly different than your main call to action, especially if that call to action is at the bottom of the screen. If you're just dealing with a small checkbox or a small radio button, it's probably okay to reuse the same blue style or whatever your primary style is, because it won't take away that much power. But if it's the exact same size and the exact same screen, and it can cause a little bit of confusion between which one is the primary action, then you probably need to go with a different style that complements the primary action instead of kind of competes with it. All right, lastly, for the state here, we've got like an on drag. So this would be clicking and holding and moving around on the screen. This might be tapping and holding and moving around on the screen. Basically, we want things to come forward into the foreground to almost simulate that you've picked something up. And we might make the color lighter. We might drop a cast a shadow. And then if there's drop targets, we might have a list of things that where it's like, you can drop this here. Think of like uploading a video or uploading any file onto a website or rearranging something in an iOS app. You might want to show dragging that thing and showing where I could possibly drop this to let the user know what's actually happening. Okay, now let's move on to the function. Really, I'm just looking at primary and secondary actions here, and also tertiary. I know I've got an entire lesson on primary and secondary colors and things like that. So this is just really a recap of using these buttons in this way. So I might have a standard primary style the same way that I have on all of these default buttons. I would consider all of this kind of like a primary style. And then my secondary button might be, maybe it's the exact same hue as this, but it's just set to 10%. And then I'm reusing that primary color, but just in a slightly different way. So I've got a nice secondary action. But if I'm using a form and there's like a save button and a cancel, I might not want a big secondary action that commands as much attention as your normal secondary action. Even in this case, this one is kind of a muted version of this one up here. Still in the same kind of HSB color space, just only 4 saturation and about 94 brightness. But this is commanding a lot more attention than this is. And you could even argue that you could go with a subdued cancel button that's a little bit more gray. So in the case of saving versus canceling, I probably wouldn't equate cancel as a secondary action because I want so much emphasis and so much unmistakability on that primary save button that I don't want to give any weight, any unnecessary power to a cancel when it's just not quite the same. It's like save or just completely back out. It's not like filter and then sort and then save. It's not quite the same. So I might be tempted to make this more of like a tertiary style versus a secondary. And then you might have some kind of odd color scheme and you might think, well, we're using green as our primary color, but maybe your primary calls to action are actually dark. So this could be a toss-up where you might have secondary colors and you could have primary colors, and you could honestly go either way with this. Maybe all of your primary calls to action, your save buttons, everything could be green with this black text, and then all of your filter, sort, edit profile, all of those buttons could be the dark color. Or you could switch it up completely and go with a dark primary call to action and the green as almost like a brand color secondary. So it kind of gives you a little bit of leeway when you're dealing with specific colors, and you might bring in a really dark reversed image or reverse color button. You could kind of go either way with that. And I think the dark color definitely has a stronger contrast, but the green also grabs your attention. So this is just an example of when it might not be so clear as to what you should make your primary call to action versus your secondary. And you might even be tempted, maybe you bring in secondary elements. If you were going to use this as primary, maybe your primary action is always the green button on a black background versus the secondary element is always like this. And there's different ways that you could go about it. You could tone down that dark button using some green text. So there's a little bit of flexibility, even with something as simple as 2 different colors and trying to change this to work, really depending on how it feels, how you want it to feel inside of your app. And this last example for secondary and primary, this is kind of a contrast to the save and cancel here. So imagine you have a bunch of search results and you want to save your search query or something like that. Well, you might need actual better, bigger buttons for sorting and filtering, but then you also want to be able to save the search, or maybe there's another, maybe this is the search button and it's used as the primary color right then. And so this just kind of gives a little bit more weight to the actions that this might pertain to versus when you're trying to save something versus canceling. You don't want those to be quite as powerful together. Whereas in this case, it's okay to bring the power up and the visual contrast up on the sorting and the filtering, because it's not so much a polar opposite choice the same way that save and cancel is. Like sorting, filtering, searching, those are all kind of in the same ballpark, but it's obvious that search is the primary call to action versus the others, they're a little bit secondary. So use this guide just as a starting point. Like I said, you can go any direction that you want with any of this. You don't have to use background colors. You could use text only, and you could experiment with a lot of different styles. This is just a good basic starting point. These sizes and styles and states and function, these are not going to serve you wrong if you don't know what you're doing. So if you're still getting used to adding buttons and interactivity to your designs, by all means take these as an example of where to get started, and then maybe you just modify it from there. If you feel very comfortable with this whole thing, then you can do something completely new, completely different. That is a kind of a wild stylistic departure. But just remember that these are a good starting point and should serve you well for most of your projects moving forward.